Today we're going to talk about laser tattoo removal. For those of you who got tattoos that you regret, tattoos you do not remember getting, this is a very unique and relatively efficient way to remove that tattoo. So let's talk about it and most importantly learn how it works. So in order to understand laser tattoo removal, we have to understand lasers. So I'm not a physicist. I'm going to try my best to explain how lasers work. I watched a couple YouTube videos, so let's see how this goes. So a laser stands for light amplification by simulated emission of radiation. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to amplify light by simulating radiation, which is the spontaneous release of energy. So we know a laser is some kind of structure, right? This thing right here, we've seen them before. So we know that light travels in this structure, in this consistent beam. And the lasers produce, like I just mentioned, a narrow beam of light. What's interesting is that this light has similar wavelengths. So light can travel in waves, and the difference between the tops of these waves are wavelengths. And each wavelength, depending on the range, produces a different color. So this green light would be a wavelength that produces green light. So let's do an overview of some physics. When it comes to electrons and light, we have to understand a couple things. So let's say you have an electron, this one right here. When an electron gets excited, it moves from the ground state to the excited state. So it moves up in energy level. But when it's at this energy level, it doesn't stay there for long. Let's say a photon passes by, a little piece of light. What happens is that photon will interact with that excited electron. That excited electron will then drop down in energy level, and it will produce a photon identical to the one that struck it. So let's say this is the original photon and this is the copy. So that's the general gist of how light can be emitted via radiation. So this, what I just described to you, happens on a larger scale. So this is a solid state laser. We're not going to talk about these specifics, but in here, let me zoom in here. Let's say you have a bunch of these excited electrons. What you'll do is you have a pump source, and this source is, light, electricity, but it's a source of energy. And that energy will strike these electrons. And just like I mentioned before, a wave of light or particle, whatever, will hit an electron, and then it'll be copied. And if you think about that here, it's going to keep getting copied and copied and copied and copied and copied until now you have a bunch of photons just bouncing around. So in this structure, we have mirrors, and these mirrors reflect these photons. So then you have photons bouncing back and forth and back and forth. And at the same time, these photons are the exact same wavelength. So eventually, after bouncing back and forth and back and forth, it moves through this hole. And because it's the same wavelength, it produces a narrow beam of light. This is just a basic definition to my understanding. So that's kind of how a laser works. Let's get deeper into talking about the types of lasers that laser tattoo removal will use. So the QSwitch laser is a laser that's used to remove tattoos. This uses brief, powerful pulses of energy to break up tattoo ink. Because of the size of the skin cells and tattoo ink, the skin cells stay intact. So when you see that blistery, damaged skin when a tattoo is removed, that's just a healing process. Those skin cells aren't destroyed. What's interesting is that the wavelength of light of the laser has to be specific to the color of the ink. There are certain wavelengths of light that remove certain colors. So for example, a red tattoo will use a green light wavelength to remove the color red. From a tattoo removal website, I saw that wavelengths of 1064 nanometers and 532 nanometers treat majority of tattoos, which means if you pulse a laser at one of these wavelengths, you'll pretty much remove the vast majority of the different types of ink. Most colors absorb these wavelengths, so obviously there are exceptions. So for example, here, a wavelength of 785 will remove blue ink the best. A wavelength of 532 will remove yellow ink the best. 785 I didn't mention. That wavelength is good for a few very specific colors, but overall 1064 and 532 are the ones that treat vast majority of tattoos. And so when these lasers are fired, it kind of destroys the structure of that ink, causing us to perceive a colorlessness because of the change in the structure, which is how this all works. Okay, so what's interesting about laser tattoo removal is that this is a process. I was kind of aware of this, but this is interesting. So removing a tattoo takes some sessions. From what I saw, about 5 to 10 sessions, each about 6 weeks apart. So I don't know how standard this is, but it does seem like there needs to be a pretty big gap between the sessions. So why? Tattoo ink is delivered at different depths in the skin layers. So what happens is, as you treat the tattoo with this pulsing laser, you're gonna treat different depths from the shallow to the deep. The length of time really is needed so the body can clear out the broken up ink, using the immune system, help heal the skin. And then once that ink is clear enough, the next session can be performed. I'm assuming the technician who's doing it and who's working with the person will check back with the patient and see how the recovery is going. Time allows for the body to heal itself, because this is the big piece. We need to use our body's natural abilities to clear out that ink, so you're not going to completely damage the skin, because you want that process to be smooth and you really want to remove as much as you can. So it does take some time. Now, when you do get a laser tattoo removal, there are extensive before and after treatment instructions, just because you want to make sure your skin is taken care of, that you're aware of the possible side effects and all sorts of different things. The website I got this from was very, very in-depth and detailed, which I really, really liked. So the side effects you can expect are things like scabbing, itching, blistering, swelling, sometimes infection. I think this really depends on maybe the aftercare or maybe complications from the removal. And so up here, this is what I see when I see videos or pictures of people getting their tattoos removed. I've always wondered what that is, and that's just the healing process. And so I don't know how accurate this is. I got this picture randomly. I don't know if it's perfect, but it kind of just shows you the different stages that this person's arm has gone through. The whole idea, like I said, is that each time you do it, you take some time to heal, then you do it again and again and again. It takes some time, but hopefully most, if not all, of the tattoo is removed. And then I know sometimes when people get a tattoo removed, they'll just have it replaced with something else, because it's not always perfect, but your goal is to get almost all of it removed as much as possible. Let's go through the summary and review what we learned. We first had a brief discussion on lasers. We talked about how sometimes electrons get excited, and when photons hit those excited electrons, an identical photon is released. And a laser is a structure that has this pump source that feeds this structure light or energy. And this structure is full of these excited electrons. And when these photons hit those excited electrons, you get a copy of the photon. And then more copies happen, and more copies happen, and more copies happen. And they bounce off these mirrors, all in the same wavelength, and they shoot out of the opening to produce a narrow beam of light. We then talked about the QSwitch laser, this brief, powerful laser that uses pulses of energy. And each pulse can use certain wavelengths of light to destroy the tattoo ink and remove the color. We talked about how there's a few different wavelengths that remove most tattoos, like a red tattoo will be removed by a green light wavelength. And most colors absorb these wavelengths and allow for the color itself to be removed as much as possible. We then talked about how removing a tattoo is a process. It takes a bunch of different sessions with enough time spread out between them so that the skin can heal and the natural process of recovery can move forward. And then as you do more and more sessions, the goal is that the tattoo gets more faded and faded and faded. And then there can be side effects with healing, scabbing, blistering, itching, swelling. And really all of this is resulted because of the way the immune system reacts to stimuli, in this case, a laser being fired at it. So that's all I got. I know this was a short video. I hope you guys learned a lot. I think it was interesting for me to do research for this video because I had no idea how these things worked. So as always, thank you so much for watching and listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another video.